All right, guys. Well, I would like to talk to you guys about Holders, a game I've been working on for, the last 5 years, I think, and the last year professionally. Um, it has quite an interesting, let's say, origin story. So I wish to share with you all of that. Hopefully, what you can get away from this presentation, if this wants to work, we'll do it the old-fashioned way. Yes, why should you care? Well, I used some unorthodox ways to build this little project. And this is kind of like, maybe for some people that will be very interesting to see, like, okay, you can apparently also make a game like this. And other people, you will be like, what is this? I would never want to touch this. And I think it's a win-win, because either way you find some new tools, or you are like, I'm good the way I am, I'm good the way everything is going. Win-win. But I also would like to go a little bit further. Because I was preparing this presentation, I was thinking about, what is all of our proceduralism like doing? What's the point of it, right? Are we engineers trying to optimize, trying to do more in less time? Or can we use the fact that we are now quite good at, generating geometry? Can we do something more with that? Can we tell a story with that? Can we make a bigger point? My name is Jos Feenstra. I profile myself as a spatial software developer and a tech artist. I'm the co-founder of GeoFriend, a Delft-based software studio, and you'll see me walking around in the worlds of computer-aided design, building information modeling, and geospatial information systems, if that rings a bell to anyone. Yes, this is what I want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you how an architecture student decided to build games, and the challenges I faced along the way. And we'll end with a quick look at what POLDERS looks like right now. But first, what is POLDERS? POLDERS is a sandbox crafting game that's now under active development. All the footage that I will be showing you guys is very early alpha, as we're trying to still explore where we're going with this project. Nonetheless, I would love to show you guys some early footage. All right, so in this game, you take on the role of a 17th century dijkgraaf, a dike warden, set in the olden days of the Netherlands. Your city has been ravaged by a storm, and you have the task to rebuild it from completely scratch. So you will make enclosed areas of land, place windmills on top of those dikes to drain the land like the Dutch did, and slowly but surely polder your way into a thriving city. And it's wishlistable on Steam. So, let's see. How did this all start? Well, as a little kid, I was obsessed with shapes, geometry. I had all sorts of like Escher paintings in my room, and I just couldn't stop staring at them. I also love doing origami, and I still do, which is of course the craft of like starting with a square paper and then somehow morphology changing it into something that can be more recognizable as art. Geometry was my whole life, and no wonder that I then chose to pursue the study of architecture for my bachelor's. And in architecture, you often find yourself asking the question, why did we shape the world like this, right? Like what was, by the way, I'm curious, how many people know this building? Look at that, look at that. I would say like 30% of the room. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water, one of the most famous villas in the world, actually. And you might be wondering, why did he choose to place it like this? Like, why build on top of a waterfall? Like, if I were to design a villa, I would to expect it that it would be somewhere located where we're now looking from, right? To be like, I want to look over a waterfall. Like, why do you build on top of it? And moreover, what's the decision in all these shapes? Why these extrusions? I can tell you, but I just would love you to just wonder for a second. Like, why don't we stop and think about these particular aspects? I see a question. Exactly. That's completely right. It's if you squint your eyes, you can see that sort of the layeredness of this waterfall, like the rocky areas and the dark areas beneath. Frank Lloyd Wright decided to continue that upwards. Like, his point was to make a non-intrusive building and make it elevate the natural landscape instead of, being an imposing force into that landscape. So really nice that you spotted that. That's exactly the point here. And you also might be wondering, what was the whole idea of this room? Well, it's obviously a place of worship, but why make that very high? And if this is a place of worship, what are we doing right now? Are we worshiping technology? What's the point, right? This is how an architect thinks. You're just constantly asking questions of why? Why? And in the field of architecture, you also have this whole sports area of parametric modeling, which I would say is exactly the same as procedural modeling, but then applied to the built environment. So you're trying to conjure up more complex shapes. And yeah, I love this stuff. I went really deep into this. And you're also, when you're doing those things, you end up with the Houdini fans in this crowd might recognize some of those nodes. It's very similar to Houdini. You just built this huge parametric scripts of just geometric operations. This whole script I made as part of a job that I had at that point to not design buildings, but glasses. So this was a frame that would perfectly fit anyone's face. So, and you can see that it's doing way more than just sort of morphing it, box-shaped. It actually just generated this entire mesh from scratch, from first principles, using all these steps. And this is a sports glass, so it's really nice that it perfectly fits your face. Yes, and then that part of me grew out of hand. I dived into the field of geoinformatics for my master's degree, which was a whole... it's practically, you're doing quite similar things, but then applied for... You use all these procedural techniques to generate meshes, generate landscapes based on the actual real-world data. So you often have airborne photography, or you have LiDAR scans, and you're trying to analyze that, make sense of it. And I just find it fascinating how much that whole subject area looks like the sort of things that you have been seeing right now during this talk, these talks. And then one day, I came across this little tool, this little beautiful toy, which is of course Townscaper by Oscar Stallberg, a tool I imagine most of you guys are quite familiar with. And I was just completely blown away by what this tool did. It's actually kind of remarkable how by just toying around with this tool, you get a sense of something that city planners and architects have a really hard time articulating, which is the idea of city morphology. So a city structure emerges around a river or maybe a mountainside, and somehow that has an effect that goes throughout the entire city. And while playing around with Townscaper, you sort of get a feel for that. You sort of discover okay, wait, okay, so if I build a center here, then a street, and people notice that. You look at this and you're like, yeah, that kind of, now this is of course a nonsensical city, but it makes sense somehow. It reminds us of old inner cities. And at that time, I was working as a geodetic engineer, and I was staring at, data from the Netherlands, and I was wondering, could you make a game to tell people how the entire Dutch landscape was made? So geography for autodidacts, you just play around and suddenly you discover how the land came to be. So I set out to start building. Okay, how do you build a Dutch terrain? So this is a little part of Delft. Well, how would you represent that in data form? Well, you can imagine Maybe it's a grid-based city where you build like certain cells become buildings. Maybe it's completely free form, like the lovely tool Tiny Glade over there. But like this does not look like the Netherlands, right? It's a grid. Like this is a very, like, let's say, an American interpretation of a European context. And while Tiny Glade is lovely, it's also sometimes a bit hard to, if you give players a completely free form approach to building, some get lost in the details. It sometimes becomes very complicated to do anything. And so I wanted to see if there could be a nice sort of middle ground in particularly giving people the opportunity to build things. And once again, Downscaper to the rescue. I found the grid that Oscar Stallberg came up with or made famous to be a very good Goldilocks zone of giving people a organic feel in a city, but still maintaining the grid-like nature of just plopping down buildings, which is just, yeah, a lot more practical. And if you look at this pattern, you can see how that alludes to these types of landscapes that are naturally formed over time and increasingly became more chaotic as time went on. So how does, and let's start calling this grid what it is, right? It's a Stallbergian grid. I think at this point we can sort of not call this a irregular, unilateral, quadrilateral grid. It's quite a mouthful. So how to make a Stallbergian grid? I was alluding back to thinking back to the whole parametric modeling days and wondering like, okay, can I use these parametric modeling kernels? So can I use my version of Houdini, let's say? Well, yes, I can. But also, I don't know if anyone has tried to use Houdini to make a real-time application. But I can tell you that this is very similar to that experience where you're almost always forced to build some server-side instance of the whole thing running and then executing that. And that's just too many steps. It's you needing an internet connection to use this. That's not how you can really make an interactive tool, I would say. So I knew that at the point I needed my own geometry kernel. And why I decided to make my own was more or less to, after toying so much with, let's say, my version of Houdini and building many plugins for it, I felt that my tools were sort of locked in there. I had many other opportunities to use parametric tooling, but I couldn't extract all that knowledge out of it because I sort of didn't know my foundations. I didn't know how to translate that to another foundation. So I was like, let's build my own. So then you go into a pretty large grocery list of things you want to build if you try to build your own geometry kernel. And you start asking way too many questions about like, what's the engine ecosystem? What the hell am I going to do? The task is huge. So one step at a time, I decided to take a approach where I just start small, build a small repertoire of increasingly complex geometric operations, and then try to compose those pieces into a geometry kernel, and then hopefully at the end build a Stallberg grid. So I went on modeling things. I started out with just JavaScript and TypeScript. Nothing else, no engine, no nothing. I just want you to just have your browser and the code and spawn the thing. That's the only way that you can truly start discovering like, okay, what are actually all the building pieces needed to make this? You can go there. It's a great idea to give people a chance to look on their phone while you're having a talk. But if you want to check out all of these little experiments, you can. And you can see here a first approach on like making a Stallbergian grid on a spherical world. And I have many other little demos like this. Like there was a first attempt at doing the wave function collapse. If anyone knows that, there was some marching square cubes in there. And it obviously looks very programming arty, but I was so proud of this. Like this had nothing to do with any engine. It had nothing to do with anything. And now I knew that if I ever needed one of these tools, I could just bring all of this code over to whatever environment. Can you make a game out of this? Well, yeah, but still, I noticed that as the code base grew, this whole hacky setup of JavaScript and TypeScript just wasn't cutting it to truly make a game out of it. I don't know if there's probably a lot of people who can make games like that, but I felt that I was losing control. And that's why I started moving to Rust. I don't know if people know Rust. Can I see some hands for people? Look at that. It's getting more famous by the year. That's great to see. Rust is a systems level programming language and is often marketed as C++, but safe. Yeah, there's a lot to be said about it. I would say it's a comfortable language to build in and have a lot of performance, and know that whatever you write in Rust, there's not a new layer that you ever need to explore underneath. Your code will run bare metal, and it will run everywhere that way. By the way, why not, Unity and Unreal? Like, why the hell would you even attempt something as crazy as building a whole game in Rust? Again, I cannot speak for. I have tried to build this whole tech stack in Unity and Unreal. What I found is it felt a lot like the problems I was experiencing with building plugins into Grasshopper. That's the sort of Houdini equivalent for architects, where I felt that if I were to build a lot of tools in these environments, they would be locked up. They would be inevitably tied to this whole environment. And so building your own systems just had just felt better. But I can't say that this is the right approach. I can't recommend it. It's just like, hey, if you want to explore, maybe try it. So I moved everything to a huge Rust monorepo, which increased a lot of performance. I could be more precise. Like, I really knew that this was the environment that I wanted to really build some code in. And it just also, I noticed that up to this point, I have never felt a moment where the project seemed to, like, out of scope. It's still all maintainable for some magical reason. And I'm not sure why, but I think Rust has something to do with that. It's also really good for, like, building a monorepo. Rust has some really nice modern tools. And yeah, so more programmer art. I tried to, like, render text. I sliced a mesh up with a sort of planar cutting thing. And I tried to build some Voronoi-inspired clouds. And I tried my luck at finally building the tools that I needed for that Stolberg grid all the way back. Last little question I would love to ask you guys, but who has ever, like, built their own mesh class, like their own mesh structure? I would love to. Yeah, like this is surprising to me. Like, there are so many opinions in how you organize your data, how you organize mesh data, and yet not many of us have really dived into the specifics of, like, how do I just load vertices, how do I load triangles? I would really like to invite you guys to explore that one day, because you will discover many interesting things. So like this, like thanks to some of the studies I did for geomatics, I was able to come up with a data structure that is based on half-edges, if anyone is familiar with that. In any case, this supports n-gons instead of triangles. So this was very useful for building the type of tech that you need to generate the types of grids that you see in Townscaper. I won't go into specifics right now. But with all that tech in place, the actual script to generate a pattern like this was actually quite easy. And so this came out, and I was like, yeah, it's not perfect, but I think this is starting to look like what we need. An interesting byproduct was that this script could be used with any base, any mesh as a base. So you could, take a sphere and then run the script on it. You could, like, this is one of those little things that you discover if you just build these things from ground up, from just first principles. You can discover that, okay, what if I were to start with a cylinder? How does the terrain look like? You'll see how this will come back. But yeah, we have to, now we have that Stolberg grids. Okay, cool. Nice. Let's turn it into some land. By the way, how are we doing in terms of time, I'm wondering? I'm never Okay, 8 minutes. Perfect. Okay. I think if we're... Yeah, I do want to cover this. So, even though I really like the approach of like just try to make everything yourself to as an explorative opportunity to see like what like hidden paths are hidden from, or what paths are hidden from me by the tools that I use. I did, however, discover that building a whole game engine at your own is quite a lot of work, and this is where this was a perfect moment that you just look into the communities, and Bevy is the biggest Rust game engine now out there, completely open source. And it has a very powerful ECS system. And I decided to adopt this to not be completely taken away by the whole DIY virus that some programmers are definitely guilty of, and me included. And what I really liked about Bevy is it really helps with dealing with the interfacing between a programming language as solid as Rust and the more sort of crazy scenarios you get into when building a game where everything interacts with everything. Bevy is a very nice intermediate layer. If anyone knows TinyGlade also uses some of the components from Bevy. And I'll quickly go through these. So I built some margin cubes models in Blender. And yes, I basically added some trilinear interpolation to make sure that the meshes you create in Blender or whatever get translated well into all those like weirdly skewered shapes you see in those things. And if you're dealing with a mesh that spans multiple blocks, you cut it into pieces. You check for every vertex in every, let's say, blocked out area of a bigger asset. You check, okay, like where are these vertices? And then one by one, move them to the corresponding cube shape on the weird quadrilateral grid, the Stolberg grid. And after all of that work, and we have now spanned like 4 or 5 years of me just writing this in my bedroom, we finally had some sort of landscape that started to look like it might be something Dutch happening here. And what I also liked is, because of that weird, interesting tech stack that you could just throw any mesh that you make in Blender and just make a terrain out of this, I suddenly now also could spawn this on a planet, and even like on a Stanford bunny, and this weird shape. Like I'm not certain what to do with this yet, but I just love that accidents like this happen if you build your own tools like this. All right. Now I would love to share you guys something about POLDERS, the game that all of this alluded to. This is what it looks like right now. So, yeah, you might be wondering what's the whole idea of this game. Well, in this game, you build things with blocks. Those blocks will eventually turn into like windmills based on configuration. There's an in-world crafting system. And well, if you, for example, build a farm, then you can start growing tulips with that farm. And you sell those things, you trade them away. And from those trades, you get more products or more blocks to start building with. And the water in all of this is your biggest friend and your worst nightmare. And if you don't respect it, it will have some consequences. The whole point of this game was to trick players into building the Netherlands. So instead of trying to build my own generator that spawns perfect like Dutch levels, I thought it would have been way more fun if you introduced mechanics that trick players into making all of those like algorithmic actions to start making it look like the Netherlands. So in other words, don't show, don't tell, but experience how the land was shaped by, on the one hand, culture, so you as a player, and then also nature. Yeah, so one of the ways it's shaped by culture is that you start out with not a lot of land. So you start making enclosures, draining land with windmills. You're forced to dig ditches everywhere to drain the land, making it very hard to produce on that land, but creating exactly the types of problems that you want players to experience. Yeah, and then you also need every house to be reachable by foot and by waterway. And this leads players to sort of build canals just by accident. And we refer back to all sorts of like cultural little things, like these are knotwilgen. You'll see them everywhere in the Dutch landscape. And these are actually, I didn't know this, but the roots of these trees actually reinforce dikes and all sorts of like waterfronts that are placed in. And that's also added as a mechanic. Lastly, as a calamity for the player, we introduced something called the water wolf, which is actually how the Dutch referred to the water back in the day. It was a demon, the water, that suddenly could bite away at your dikes. If you ever see these types of things in the Dutch landscape, it's really interesting. These are formed by a sort of a whirlpool after a dike break happens. So these are actually scars. And these whirlpools that were created by the sheer force of water going through that weak point made it so that it was very hard to recreate the dike around in that area. So they had to always build a dike around it. Fascinating. And again, lovely opportunities for gameplay there. We're currently working on deepening the gameplay, adding like way more cultural elements and way more features. And we're also expanding on the art front. Danielle is building these amazing, actually Dutch painter-inspired buildings. This is all Ruisdael, if anyone knows the paintings of Ruisdael. Yes, so expect this sort of my programmer art to be updated quite soon. All right, so if there's anything I would love to you guys to take away from this whole talk is I wonder if we can do a bit more with our procedural systems. Like, I wonder if you could look at your own procedural projects and be like, okay, but how can I use these elements to really tell a story? How can I use these elements to engage the player in a whole new way of just experimenting with the world? All right, POLDERS is on not an early access. It's up for wish lists on Steam. And I would also, if you want to talk more of me, please join the Discord, where I'll be readily available. Guys, thank you so much. Thanks.